The announcement lasted less than a minute, but its consequences reached across generations, shaking the very foundations of the British monarchy behind closed doors. Prince William stepped forward with extraordinary care, choosing his words as if navigating a fragile glass bridge, and confirmed that Princess Charlotte would officially assume a newly created role as the Crown's first royal youth ambassador. This unprecedented position was designed to place his young daughter beside him at selected charitable and ceremonial engagements, focusing specifically on children's well-being, education, and community service. However, nobody applauded immediately. Behind the ornate palace doors, stunned faces, heavy silence, and whispered anxieties among senior courtiers revealed one terrifying truth that everyone attempted to conceal. This monumental decision had instantly changed the royal future forever. William let the silence settle across the long, polished mahogany table at Windsor Castle, allowing the sheer weight of his declaration to be absorbed by every member of the royal household present. Catherine, Princess of Wales, watched Charlotte with a complex mixture of immense pride and deep-seated maternal fear, knowing all too well the relentless machinery of public scrutiny that awaited any royal stepping into the spotlight at such a tender age. King Charles lowered his piercing eyes toward the documented briefing papers spread before him, his expression tightening as he realized the profound constitutional implications of introducing a child into active public duties. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla remained entirely still, her sharp eyes registering the undeniable shift in authority and signaling that a major precedent was being forged without her household's prior consent. The Royal Youth Ambassador title, William calmly explained, was strictly a supervised position that would never alter the legal line of succession or the traditional order determining who ultimately inherits the British throne. Yet, despite its non-constitutional limitations, it would grant his daughter a public voice unlike any authority ever granted to a royal child before her in modern history. Charlotte felt every face in the grand room slowly turn toward her, her heart racing as the reality of the moment washed over her small frame. She had genuinely wanted to help struggling children find a voice, but the sudden, suffocating weight of becoming an active part of the monarchy's future felt overwhelmingly cold and intimidating. Sensing her sudden panic, Catherine reached discreetly beneath the heavy table and tightly held her daughter's trembling hand, offering a silent reminder of unconditional support. The princess understood with heartbreaking clarity how rapidly public service could transform into heavy personal sacrifice, and she fiercely refused to let roaring public applause steal the peaceful childhood her daughter so richly deserved. King Charles abruptly closed the heavy leather folder with a sharp snap that echoed across the silent room, breaking the suffocating tension. "Does she truly understand what you are placing on her vulnerable shoulders?" the monarch asked, his voice laced with protective warning and lingering skepticism. William did not retreat an inch from his father's intense gaze. He firmly explained to the king that Charlotte herself had directly requested this heavy responsibility after witnessing how desperately children struggled to be heard by a world of indifferent adults. A recorded private conversation safely preserved her heartfelt wish, proving that she wanted to stand beside young people as an equal rather than looking down upon them from an untouchable pedestal of royal privilege. The monarch looked searchingly toward his young granddaughter, yet his deep-seated concerns regarding her emotional safety and mental well-being remained entirely unresolved. William then calmly confirmed the specific detail that instantly altered Camilla's expression and sent shockwaves through the royal staff. Charlotte's very first supervised public appearance would take place directly beside him at the upcoming National Children's Service Ceremony, a prestigious national gathering honoring young volunteers and charitable organizations supporting youth welfare. The Queen Consort immediately voiced her sharp objection, demanding to know why her own household staff had not been permitted to review or advise on the arrangement beforehand. William delivered his reply with unyielding firmness, stating that both Catherine and he had fully approved the initiative through their own private foundation, thereby drawing an impenetrable boundary around the next generation. Camilla heard the unmistakable message loud and clear. The internal balance of authority was rapidly shifting within the family, and the future king was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to shape his own family's destiny. Yet, even amidst the heavy political tension filling the room, Young Charlotte acutely noticed the emotional struggles happening all around her. As heavy chairs shifted across the floor and senior courtiers began departing in tense silence, she saw that her grandfather, King Charles, remained seated entirely alone at the far end of the long table, one trembling hand resting heavily upon the closed confidential file. Charlotte instinctively paused for a brief moment at the heavy oak doorway, realizing with startling maturity that her grandfather's absolute silence was not born out of stubborn anger, but rather out of deep, paralyzing fear for her future. And before she could fully comprehend the true source of that profound anxiety, she would inevitably have to confront the heavy demands this historic honor would relentlessly extract from every single person she loved. To the wider public watching from afar, Charlotte had suddenly become a shining symbol of modern royal renewal and youthful hope. But to Prince William, she remained simply the vulnerable young daughter whose small hand he instinctively reached for whenever they navigated crowded, chaotic rooms. That sharp contradiction made the surprising new royal appointment simultaneously inspiring and deeply dangerous for her upbringing. One part of William passionately believed that his daughter possessed the natural empathy needed to give ordinary young people a genuine voice in society. However, another darker part of his mind vividly remembered what relentless media attention and public pressure had done to his own traumatic childhood, making him terrified that he was unlocking the exact same cage for her. Charlotte had consistently shown unusual composure and quiet confidence during previous public ceremonies, yet her devoted parents had fought tooth and nail to keep the rest of her everyday life remarkably ordinary. She attended school daily, followed familiar family routines, and consistently returned home without ever being treated like a working royal. That specific term described any senior family member who regularly performed official public duties on behalf of the crown, carrying the immense weight of institutional expectation. Her brand new position directly threatened that carefully guarded balance, because even the most limited public service would inevitably create massive societal expectations that would follow her everywhere she went. William carried heavy emotional memories of grief, media intrusion, and institutional pressure that Catherine could never fully share from her own middle-class upbringing. Television cameras had mercilessly watched him grieve, grow, and struggle through his formative years long before he ever truly understood how to protect himself from harsh public judgment. Catherine, by contrast, had entered adult royal life willingly and knew what it felt like to be closely examined. But William had experienced that crushing psychological pressure as a helpless child. Their vastly different personal histories ultimately led them toward the exact same shared fear: that Charlotte might succeed brilliantly in her public humanitarian role while simultaneously suffering silently behind closed doors. William deliberately waited until the family sat together privately, without the interference of political advisors or courtiers, to address the looming elephant in the room. He leaned gently toward his daughter and asked directly whether she felt frightened by the massive responsibilities heading her way. Charlotte looked down at her polished shoes for a long moment before quietly admitting that she was indeed afraid of the unknown future. Then, she slowly lifted her eyes, looked straight into her father's eyes, and uttered words of startling wisdom. Fear should not stop someone from helping children who feel adults never listen. The prince heard profound courage echoing in those simple words, but beneath the bravery, he also heard heartbreaking innocence, and that vulnerability frightened him more than anything else. Catherine immediately moved closer to her daughter, kneeling down beside her chair, so she could hold both of Charlotte's trembling hands in her own. She solemnly promised that this new role would never, under any circumstances, take precedence over her education, personal privacy, or fundamental childhood happiness. Charlotte gripped her mother's hands tightly, momentarily exposing the intense excitement and raw vulnerability she had tried so hard to conceal from the world. The young princess felt fiercely proud of the trust placed in her, yet she deeply understood that one successful public engagement could easily encourage the palace machinery to demand another appearance, and then another, until a strictly voluntary duty transformed into an inescapable obligation. King Charles subtly deepened that underlying unease during a later recorded private conversation with William, noting that Charlotte's remarkable composure reminded him of the late Queen Elizabeth II, whose legendary sense of duty defined an entire historical era. The king undoubtedly intended the comparison as high praise, but for William, the historical parallel carried a chilling echo. Elizabeth had indeed inspired millions across the globe, but in doing so, she had also surrendered almost all of her private self to the unyielding demands of the crown. William later opened a heavily sealed planning note, a confidential proposal kept strictly locked away until senior family approval was secured, and discovered with mounting alarm that Charlotte's official responsibilities were designed to expand gradually over time. The confidential document explicitly outlined future youth visits, charitable roundtables, and carefully supervised appearances that stretched far into the foreseeable future. This was no longer just one isolated symbolic ceremony. Someone within the institutional machinery had already mapped out an entire lifelong path for his young daughter without his explicit final consent. As the heavy doors remained shut and the palace staff waited anxiously outside, the turbulent stage was firmly set for a fierce generational battle over childhood duty, parental protection, and the absolute limits of royal authority. The decision to grant Charlotte her historic role did not begin inside a sterile strategy meeting or among the polished leather-bound files of senior palace courtiers. It began months earlier during a crowded public engagement when a frightened, crying child lost sight of his family in a dense sea of strangers, and Charlotte noticed the crisis long before any trained adult security personnel even blinked. What followed next lasted only a few fleeting seconds, yet Prince William never forgot the raw composure his daughter displayed. While experienced officials hesitated, frozen by protocol and red tape, and cameras continued recording every panicked movement, his young daughter stepped directly toward the confusion with a calm, reassuring grace that exposed an innate instinct far beyond any ceremonial training. Months before the official announcement, Charlotte had arrived beside William and Catherine expecting nothing more than a quiet, low-profile supporting appearance at a standard public charity event. The youth service ceremony was an ordinary official gathering created specifically to honor hardworking schoolchildren, local community volunteers, and various charities dedicated to advancing youth education and mental health support. Her devoted parents firmly believed the engagement offered a safe, gentle introduction to public duty because she would remain closely anchored beside them throughout the entire reception. Nobody in the royal entourage expected that single afternoon to become the explosive turning point behind her revolutionary new role. Sudden noise filled the grand hall as restless groups moved between crowded tables and invited guests waited eagerly for a brief moment to speak with the royal family members. Then, amid the swirling chaos, one young boy became entirely separated from his teacher and the rest of his school group. He frantically searched the sea of unfamiliar faces, called out once in sheer desperation, and completely froze in terror when nobody answered his plea. Several high-ranking officials and security aides noticed the emerging disturbance from afar, but rigid institutional uncertainty and protocol held them back from taking immediate action. Charlotte, however, saw something entirely different through the noise. She instantly recognized the universal look of paralyzing fear on a child's face. Moving before an experienced aide could step forward to stop her, she calmly approached the distressed child, knelt slightly to meet his eye level, asked his name in a gentle whisper, and told him with absolute certainty that he was not alone. The young boy struggled to speak through his tears, so she patiently remained right beside him, offering a steady presence, and gently asked where he had last seen his teacher. Just seconds later, a breathless aide finally located the frantic woman and successfully reunited them, replacing overwhelming panic with instant relief. Yet, the young royal's remarkably simple, compassionate response had already fundamentally changed the charged atmosphere surrounding her. Catherine felt a sudden wave of fierce maternal pride rise sharply within her chest, which was instantly followed by a chilling spike of deep fear. Her daughter had acted with genuine, unscripted human compassion, but the experienced princess fully understood how mercilessly the palace machine could twist one natural gesture into a permanent, inescapable public expectation. William felt that exact same emotional conflict tearing at his composure. He later admitted in a recorded private conversation that Charlotte's spontaneous kindness had deeply moved his heart. but it had simultaneously served as a terrifying reminder of how easily crushing institutional duty could begin long before a child even understood its heavy financial and emotional cost. Prompted by those lingering anxieties, William officially requested a confidential assessment immediately after the ceremony concluded. This assessment was a strictly private review used internally by senior family members to judge whether introducing limited public responsibilities would be safe, suitable, and emotionally manageable for a growing child. He formally asked whether Charlotte could attend carefully controlled youth engagements in the future without ever surrendering her foundational education, privacy, or carefree personal life. That single protective request quietly became the very first formal stepping stone toward creating the unprecedented royal youth ambassador position. Furthermore, Charlotte's own unfiltered words provided the entire proposal with its core moral purpose and lasting justification. A documented account written meticulously by the event coordinator recorded her asking a poignant question that pierced the hearts of all who heard it. Who listens to children when the adults are busy? William read that specific sentence repeatedly over the following days, staring at the paper in the quiet of his study. The prince no longer saw merely a fleeting compassionate moment. Instead, he envisioned a powerful, authentic voice capable of reaching young people across the nation who felt completely invisible to society. Initially, King Charles had casually approved the overarching idea during a brief private meeting, genuinely believing it amounted to nothing more than one or two harmless symbolic appearances to support youth charities. However, the king's supportive stance changed dramatically when the full, detailed proposal finally reached his mahogany desk, revealing an elaborate, gradual path of expanding institutional responsibilities over the coming years. Alarmed by the scope, the monarch abruptly closed the confidential file, summoned his son to his private chambers without delay, and sternly demanded a full explanation. What had originally begun as mutual admiration for one compassionate gesture was suddenly morphing into a fierce, uncompromising argument over childhood duty, parental boundaries, and the absolute right of the crown to claim both. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving the anxious aides stranded outside in the hallway, two vastly different visions of the modern monarchy confronted each other directly across a small table. King Charles deeply feared that young Charlotte was being recklessly dragged into the heavy machinery of public duty far too soon, risking her mental health and robbing her of her youth. Conversely, William passionately believed that shielding her completely from reality would only teach her that public service was something dark and terrifying to be avoided at all costs. Neither man raised his voice during the opening moments of the debate, but the tense atmosphere crackled with suppressed friction. However, the exact moment the king made the fatal mistake of mentioning the deep, lingering psychological scars of William's own traumatic childhood, the conversation instantly stopped being a constitutional discussion about royal precedent. It transformed into something raw, deeply personal, and painfully raw for both father and son. King Charles had summoned his son to Windsor after carefully reviewing the final, comprehensive engagement schedule for the upcoming months, expecting to find a single, highly supervised ceremony as originally discussed. Instead, the turning pages of the document detailed a structured series of charitable visits, regional youth meetings, and recurring public appearances that spanned across the calendar. William delivered the official announcement to the world, but Catherine meticulously built the ironclad boundaries that made it entirely possible behind the scenes. While the palace argued incessantly over antiquated titles, historical precedents, and flashing newspaper headlines, she focused intensely on one fundamental question. How could Charlotte serve the public without ever surrendering her precious childhood? Her answer was not based on sentimental royal traditions. It was precise, fiercely protective, and strong enough to overrule experienced courtiers who believed institutional demands always came first. The person holding the real institutional power was not the loudest figure in the room, but rather the devoted mother who flatly refused to negotiate her daughter's safety. Catherine had already studied every conceivable risk long before King Charles challenged his son over the engagement schedules. Precedents, the formal rules deciding where royal family members stand during official events, meant very little to her compared to Charlotte's emotional well-being. Together with William, she drafted a strictly limited framework, Absolutely no solo public appearances, zero involvement in controversial political subjects, strict non-interference with her daily schooling, and only a tiny, highly controlled number of supervised engagements each year. These rules mattered profoundly because one single successful public appearance could easily tempt officials to demand more and then more. William strategically placed this protective framework under the Royal Foundation, the official charitable organization through which he and his wife independently managed their long-term public projects. That crucial decision gave the parents direct, unshakable control over Charlotte's schedule, approved causes, and emotional support systems, while effectively preventing the traditional palace household from expanding her official duties without their explicit approval. The future king understood the powerful message clearly. His young daughter would serve the crown when appropriate, but she would never belong to it. Predictably, Catherine faced fierce resistance during a tense private planning meeting when a senior courtier argued that an official royal role must ultimately answer to the institution rather than personal family wishes. The advisor sternly warned that allowing Charlotte the freedom to withdraw at any moment could weaken the institutional authority surrounding the appointment. Catherine calmly closed her heavy folder and delivered a chilling reminder. Her role may serve the institution, but her childhood does not belong to any institution. The courtier instantly fell silent, realizing she would never bend. Later that evening, Catherine sat beside Charlotte in her bedroom and explained what those written protections truly meant. Bravery, she gently told her daughter, did not always mean marching blindly into a terrifying, crowded room. Sometimes, true bravery meant saying no, stepping back, or admitting that the weight had become too heavy to carry. Charlotte felt an immense wave of relief break through her suffocating anxiety, realizing she retained the right to refuse. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla discovered the hard limits of her own reach through a confidential copy of the framework document. Searching in vain for any supervisory authority over the new youth ambassador, she found none. The exclusion carried an unmistakable warning. The next reign was already taking shape, and she had no control over its newest voice. Then, an embossed invitation bearing Charlotte's new designation left Windsor, reaching Camilla's household without prior consultation and turning a private exclusion into a visible humiliation. Despite the internal friction, the public momentum was unstoppable, and by sunrise, Charlotte's name dominated global broadcasts, front pages, and conversations far beyond palace gates. The true test arrived when she stepped out of the car at the National Children's Service alongside Prince William. She did not deliver a grand political speech or wave regally. She simply stopped beside a nervous young volunteer who had dropped his notes, listened without interruption, and handed the child her own program. That single, unguarded gesture became the defining image through which the entire nation understood her appointment. Commentators praised William and Catherine for pioneering a modern family approach that allowed their daughter to help others without becoming a full-time working royal. When the event concluded and they returned to Windsor, there was no formal courtroom waiting, only family. King Charles asked the final question. Did she still want the role? Charlotte looked at her family, considered everything the announcement had unleashed, and answered yes, but only on her terms. In that quiet moment, the historical argument was finally settled. The successful engagement proved Charlotte could serve within parental safeguards without losing herself. George stood beside his sister, not ahead or behind her, representing the future heir alongside the young voice she had chosen to become. Their destinies remained separate, but their shared promise of loyalty was unbreakable. The announcement began as a palace shock, but it ended with a clear verdict. Charlotte was never prepared to compete for the crown, but rather trusted to give its youngest generation a voice, while remaining entirely herself.